Pokemon Ruby and Pokemon Sapphire first released for the Game Boy Advance in Japan on November 21st, 2002, and by July 25th, 2003, when the games finally released in Europe, the entire world had an opportunity to play Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which went on to become the best-selling Game Boy Advance game of all time. It's been almost exactly 16 years since the world got to see these games, and they've changed so much for the Pokemon franchise. This was the first time Pokemon had seen a change this drastic in its entire history. Now, I don't want to discredit the Generation 2 Pokemon games, as they did do a lot for Pokemon as well. However, for the most part, the Generation 2 Pokemon games largely focus on fixing the bugs, oversights, and limitations from the original Generation 1 Pokemon games. Once they had all of those issues sorted out, Ruby and Sapphire were poised to take the first major step for changes in Pokemon, as they had to focus less on fixing the game and more on improving the overall Pokemon video game formula. That's not to say that Ruby and Sapphire are glitchless or perfect, however, as there are still plenty of big glitches like the berry glitches, but it's much more tame than the glitchy mess that was Generation 1. Now, in terms of game mechanics, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were the first Pokemon games to introduce Pokemon abilities, Pokemon natures, secret bases, Pokemon contests, double battles, and so much more to the Pokemon franchise. Double battles are arguably the most prominent of these additions, as double battles are still used for VGC tournaments even to this day, which is the official Pokemon rule set for tournaments. I also remember as a kid first hearing and first realizing that you're able to use two Pokemon at the same time in battle. It felt like something straight out of the anime, because in the original anime, a lot of the times Jesse and James would just attack Ash with both of their Pokemon. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were also the first Pokemon games to have version-exclusive evil teams, and the only other games to have something like this are the future games that are based on Ruby and Sapphire in Emerald and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. This was one of the most interesting version differences to exist in any main series Pokemon game to date, in my opinion, and although the evil teams have a similar goal of capturing the cover legendary Pokemon and using it to flood and or dry up the world, it is nice to see how both games have a different main antagonist, with some slight differences. Both teams are still present in the other game, however, with the opposite team becoming an ally in the story. Now, while you're playing through the game and encountering Team Aqua or Team Magma, depending on which version you're playing, you also have the opportunity to check out contests in the contest hall located in various cities across the Hoenn region. In these contests, you can enter your Pokemon in various different categories such as cool or tough, which also correspond to certain moves in the game which fall into similar categories. It's almost like these moves have a secondary typing relating to cool, tough, or whatever contest you're in, just for contests alone. If you win a contest, you can also get a ribbon, which was the first time we saw ribbons in a Pokemon game, which we still even see to this day. I remember messing around with contests a lot when I was a kid, although I didn't really fully understand how they worked. I always saw these contests as sort of like Ruby and Sapphire's take on the bug catching contest from Generation 2, which was another feature I loved as a kid. Generation 2 seemed to be the king when it comes to these extra features, and although these contests aren't anything too special in their own right for Ruby and Sapphire, Generation 3 still has a lot of these nice little extra features to it that make the game pretty special. The most popular of these extra things to do for Ruby and Sapphire would have to be the secret bases. This was also a first that was introduced in Ruby and Sapphire as well, and we would see similar incarnations of this going forward in future games. Basically, you could find an open spot in the wild, such as in a bush or on the side of a mountain with these little door things, and have access to a secret room where you could decorate it with various overpriced plushes or other items found throughout the game. A lot of people tend to like these decorating features in various video games, which is probably one of the reasons why Animal Crossing is so loved, and as a kid I remember having my own secret bases, with my favorite spot being just south of Mauville City in the water, and checking out my friends' secret bases as well was a blast. The coolest thing about checking out your friends' secret bases is you didn't just have to look over their shoulder at their Game Boy Advance while they showed you their secret base, since you could mix records by connecting with a link cable, which would do various things like have your friend appear in the game's television when you would see a certain broadcast on the TV, but most importantly, it would allow you to visit your friend's secret base whenever you wanted to, even if you weren't connected to your friend's Game Boy Advance, and you could battle an NPC version of their team, which had the same 6 Pokemon that they had at the time that you mixed records. I did this a lot as a kid as well, since you would even gain EXP from these battles for whatever reason, and this is how I leveled up most of my Pokemon back then. I remember grinding against my friends' secret bases for the Pokemon 10th Anniversary Journey Across America Tour Tournament. We saw a similar feature return in the next generation Pokemon Diamond and Pearl with the underground bases, this time with a bit more to do as well as online connectivity, although something about it just lacks the same charm as the original secret bases had, despite these underground bases offering more. Maybe it's because Ruby and Sapphire, they aren't in the underground, so you can see them pretty much everywhere and a lot easier in the overworld, or maybe it's just nostalgia since Ruby and Sapphire were the first to do it. Secret bases even returned in the remake games of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which I guess was the consolation prize for not having the return of the Battle Frontier from Emerald. Pokemon Ruby and Pokemon Sapphire did have their own version of the Battle Frontier, which would come about in Emerald, sort of. There was just the Battle Tower, which appeared in a similar location as the Battle Frontier in Emerald. However, it was just this one singular tower, and it didn't offer as much as Pokemon Emerald, which greatly expanded upon the Battle Frontier era, and is, in my opinion, one of the coolest post-game things to ever exist in any Pokemon game. If you want to learn more about it, I have a video about the Pokemon Battle Frontier, which will be linked in the description. Pokemon natures and Pokemon abilities were a huge game changer as well, especially for competitive battling. They might not matter much when it comes to traditional play or when playing through the story mode, but it changed so much outside of the main game. Picking a proper nature for your Pokemon is pivotal even to this day, and the abilities of your Pokemon can completely change how the Pokemon is even used or utilized. The competitive battling change was accompanied by a redefined EV and IV system, which stands up through Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon even. This, along with the introduction of natures and abilities, allows you to really customize your Pokemon strategy and allow for various Pokemon to fulfill various different types of roles depending on which set you decide to have on these Pokemon. This was one of the biggest competitive changes Pokemon battling has ever seen, and it really shaped how battling works today. This generation even added a ton of new items that could be used as held items, as Generation 2 didn't really have that many useful held items outside of maybe a few berries and leftovers. Now, one of the more under-the-radar features of Ruby and Sapphire would be the e-reader support. Now, some of you guys might not even know what the e-reader is, as it's more of a niche Game Boy Advance add-on, but basically the GBA e-reader was an add-on for the Game Boy Advance which allowed you to scan various cards to unlock certain items in a few select Game Boy Advance games, and even GameCube games depending on what game you're talking about. As a kid, I loved the e-reader, and I remember buying packs of cards that had cards specifically just for e-readers, and more specifically just for Ruby and Sapphire for the e-reader. This allowed you to battle various trainers in Moss Deep City by scanning their cards behind that mysterious locked door in that one house. Some of these codes would unlock exclusive berries as well, and Generation 3 was responsible for adding most of these berries that we even use to this day in competitive battling. Even some of the Pokemon cards from the Pokemon TCG around this time had the codes on them as well. I'm sure most of you guys might have some of these laying around. Although they didn't exactly do anything in the various Pokemon games, they just show the Pokemon's Dex entry or unlock some sort of random weird minigame. As you might be able to tell from the e-reader in general, around this time for Nintendo and especially Pokemon in the early 2000s, Nintendo released a lot of interesting peripherals for the GBA and GameCube to make them a bit weird. We had the GameCube link cable adapter, which allowed you to connect your Game Boy Advance to your GameCube, which was present for a lot of Pokemon games on the GameCube. There was even a game called Pokemon Box for the GameCube, which essentially was a primitive version of Pokemon Bank. It even features Bridget, who also appears in Pokemon Bank. You can store Pokemon in them, and if you stored a certain amount of Pokemon, you can get various different Pokemon prizes, such as Extreme Speed Zigzagoon. Now, if you had Pokemon Coliseum and the bonus disc specifically, which I believe you got for pre-ordering Pokemon Coliseum, you could enter that bonus disc into your GameCube and transfer over an exclusive Jirachi from your copy into Ruby and Sapphire, which is one of the first and only legitimate ways to obtain a Jirachi in the 3rd generation. Now, along with this Jirachi, Ruby and Sapphire brought us a lot more event Pokemon, which was kind of a first because before Generation 3, there really weren't that many events, especially outside of Japan. Now, the unfortunate thing about these events is they all have to be done in person since Ruby and Sapphire couldn't connect online, and this was before we had the wireless adapter that came out with Fire Red and Leaf Green. But I remember getting a lot of these event Pokemon during the 3rd generation era of Pokemon. I remember going to the Nintendo store in Manhattan and hooking up my Game Boy into their system to get various event Pokemon, more specifically this Flygon that I still have to this day in my Sun and Moon game, and waiting in line for so long just to even get these event Pokemon. It might not seem like much to you guys watching this today, especially now, since event Pokemon can be obtained so much easier. You can just connect online and download them in a second, but to my 8-year-old self, they were some of the most special Pokemon I ever obtained, and I didn't mind waiting in line at all. Now, all of this led into Fire Red and Leaf Green, a remake of Generation 1 released in 2004 in the United States, and then Emerald released in 2005, which was the definitive version of Ruby and Sapphire to round out the entire Game Boy Advance and 3rd generation of Pokemon. Now, even though my first Pokemon game was Pokemon Red shortly after released in the late 90s, I still consider Pokemon Ruby and Pokemon Sapphire to be my childhood Pokemon games, so to say. I was about 8 years old when these games came out, and by that age, most of my friends at school were playing Pokemon as well, and I would say that this is the era of Pokemon that I have the most memories of, which is part of the reason of what makes Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire so special to me. I still vividly remember heading into Target and going straight for the game aisle around the time the game came out, and seeing Pokemon Ruby on the shelf. They didn't have Sapphire for whatever reason, and I remember my mom getting it for me on that day, going home, sitting on my couch, and starting my adventure in Pokemon Ruby for the very first time.